Hello students, I will start off by talking about the final question 10 on quiz number 7, which asks you about your beliefs about the future of visual communication. Will it be taken more seriously or be given more credence than it has in the recent past? And most of you said yes, it will, and you gave a variety of reasons, including things like as things become more digital and computer speeds and file sizes become more capacious, it's a lot easier to have more visual content. You mentioned things like declining attention span or the need to get people's attention quickly and maintain it. One of you said, no, it is still the case that in certain fields, in certain industries, particularly if they're data heavy or very scientific, it might be that visuals do not have quite the credibility that they have in other areas. But by and large, most of you felt that it was the case that even if there's been a long-standing prejudice in favor of words over images, we are certainly at a time when that is reversing. So now what I'm going to do is link to a video that I prepared in a previous semester. It is largely about Marshall McLuhan, which rather than having you read McLuhan, I'm going to have you view things about McLuhan. And then after that, I will have some restatements having to do with the final visual design project that should be occupying most of the rest of your time for the rest of the term. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Marshall McLuhan now. So if we go through the items in this, we've got one of the first one is this a page called McLuhanisms. So Marshall McLuhan, we've already met him once in terms of the medium is the massage, and he is famous for these sort of aphorisms. These you might call them, they're almost like a Zen statement. When he says something like, let me find one that I think is, okay, I had already mentioned this, it was in the medium as the massage. We look at the present through a rear view mirror. We march backwards into the future. So there's this saying that, you know, it could be deep and meaningful, it could be silly and not all that meaningful. But there's a whole page of McLuhanisms here. Invention is the mother of necessities. So he turns on its head that notion that necessity is the mother of invention. The car has become the carapace, the protective and aggressive shell of urban and suburban man. The trouble with a cheap, specialized education is that you never stop paying for it. So if you take a look at these McLuhanisms, you're going to see the kind of things that some people said, wow, that's pithy, that's meaningful, there's a lot in there. And other people say, this is nonsense. This is, these are sort of they sound like the ravings of a lunatic or a carnival barker. The future of the book is the blurb, okay? What could that mean? When you think of a book, books often have these little blurbs on the back that get your attention and try and get you to read the book. And he's saying the future of the book is the blurb, so that maybe there won't even be books, there'll just be blurbs. So these are the kind of things that drove some academics crazy. And it's one of the reasons why he went from being just an English professor to this probably most famous public intellectual in the 1960s, and you're going to see a couple of examples of that in the videos that I'll have you watch, and then fell out of favor as quickly as he rose. He fell out of favor equally quickly, but then his stock has re-risen, at least in some places. And so after the page on McLuhanisms, what you've got is a page that has a 15-minute video, I think it is, 14-minute video. And so Marshall McLuhan gave a lecture in Australia in 1977. And so initially he's talking to the television broadcaster, answering some general questions then. And then he takes some questions from the audience. And so I think it's worth watching for you to understand how he addresses some of these questions about what were his provocative statements. And then the next video is, it's got the author Tom Wolfe, and that's a 23-minute video. And it begins with this famous scene from a Woody Allen movie, which is actually quite funny. But in that video, Tom Wolfe, he narrates a 23-minute explanation of the central ideas of Marshall McLuhan's thought on media. And so he's attempting to make the more enigmatic statements of McLuhan understandable. And then I've got a link. It's called Two Views of the Currency of McLuhan. So both of these are from 2011. So if he's at his peak in the 60s and then in the 70s and then falls into disfavor through the 80s, but maybe then starts coming back in the 90s and the teens. In 2011, an article from a very brief article in The Guardian, it's called "Thanks, Marshall, I think we finally get the message." And it asserts that Marshall McLuhan's ideas about media seem more insightful than ever. So one of the things that can happen, somebody comes out with some new ideas, and then other scholars, look at them, analyze them, find fault with them. And certainly there's probably plenty that could be found fault with Marshall McLuhan. But he was predicting the future. And so then if 40 years later or 50 years later, people said, okay, he was wrong about some stuff, but guess what? His predictions about the future many of them seem to have come true. So that's one of the reasons why some people say he's worth going back and looking at. Then the other one, there's a slightly longer article, but still pretty short, The Appeal of Marshall McLuhan in Contemporary China. And it starts by saying nobody in the West pays attention to McLuhan anymore. This is in 2011, despite the fact that the other article from 2011 says McLuhan is sort of more relevant than, or is more insightful than ever. But the article is talking about China, says, why is it that if nobody in the West is paying attention to McLuhan, the people in China are paying attention to McLuhan? And one of the explanations for that could be that in 2011, China is just beginning to have the media exposure and media experience that the modern West was having, say, in 1960. So that could be an explanation for that difference there. So you don't have to read that whole article. You might want to read it, but basically it gives you the idea that there is still not sort of uniform consensus on the relevance and the value of Marshall McLuhan, but there seems to be at least two schools of thought that say even if he fell into disfavor shortly after his rise to popularity and fame, that has been reversed both in the West and in the East, but possibly for rather different reasons. I will switch back to your final project. You will find in this week's module a list of the different Fortune 500 companies that students in the past have chosen. You are free to choose to do one of those again, but it's just to give you an idea of the kinds of businesses that people thought might be very much in need of a redesign. On this topic, I want to sort of draw to your attention. This is a full-page ad in the New York Times from last week. And it's by Wells Fargo. So as many of you probably know, Wells Fargo last year was found to have engaged in several practices that were at least unscrupulous, if not downright illegal. And so now what they have to do is they have to try and fix their image. So they have a new tagline, established 1852, reestablished in 2018. And so one of the things that somebody could say is like, okay, we've got sort of two different graphical representations of Wells Fargo. One is the nice little red square Wells Fargo, and the other is an image of a stagecoach. It's a sort of nice, elegant-looking 19th century stagecoach that relates to Wells Fargo's origins. So one of the things that the sample redesign that I provided for you, those students used what's called a SWOT analysis, which is familiar to many people who have background in business. It stands for strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats. And they were doing Best Buy, and so they did their SWOT analysis of Best Buy as a way to figure out what they needed to change visually. After that, several people took the same model, but what I would like to recommend is if you're going to do a SWOT analysis, maybe don't dedicate it so much to the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, or threats to the business per se, but the strengths and weaknesses of its visual brand, its color design, its font choice, its logo, its tagline, and then sort of opportunities and threats for that. So an opportunity, if you're going to redesign a company, particularly if it was a company that was engaged in some sort of scandal, is you've got a whole new image, and so now people aren't going to associate the new image that maybe even have a new name for the company with the old scandal. But a possible threat is if there was high recognizability in the market, and now suddenly nobody's ever heard of this company before, and they don't even know to associate it with whatever might have been good about the company. So if you choose to include a SWOT analysis, and by, you certainly don't need to, but if you do choose to use SWOT analysis to somehow say what needs to be changed and why you're going to change it, try and turn those analyses towards the brand, towards the logo, towards the color scheme, towards the font choice, towards the tagline, rather than the company sort of writ on a larger scale. I think also I will add into this module, I chose the Brooklyn Brewery logo. I have a friend from Brooklyn, and so what I did was I took that marvelous, graphically rich logo, and I've got a friend named Andrew, so I changed it from Brooklyn Brewery to Brooklyn Andrew. So I will include that video that shows how I did that, because again, it's an example of the opportunities to take a pre-existing logo and alter it in a way that could be beneficial. So that will also be added into this week's or module 6.1. Talk to you later.